Good morning. I wanted to take just a few moments to go over Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find. Um, just to give you a little bit of extra insight into the story and understanding of Flannery O'Connor as a writer. I will walk through the story with you as quickly as I can. However, it is a little bit longer of a story, so it will take a few minutes, but we will get there. Okay. So, in your discussion board, I asked you several questions. I asked you about morality. I asked you about the moment of grace. I asked about irony and foreshadowing, and then about Flannery O'Connor's Catholic background and how that um, influences her writing. So I want to make sure that I hit on all four of those questions as we go through this. And the first place that we're really going to get is development of conflict and irony in this story. So let's just look at this opening paragraph. It says, the grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. Immediately, we are met with the conflict of this story. The grandmother doesn't want to do something, and that is going to be the driving force behind everything that happens in this story. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee, and she was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind. Bailey was the son she lived with, her only boy. He was sitting on the edge of his chair at the table, bent over the orange sports section of the journal. Now look here, Bailey, she said. See here, read this. And she stood with one hand on her thin hip and the other rattling the newspaper at his bald head. Here, this fellow calls himself the Misfit is loose from the federal pen and headed toward Florida, and you read here what it says he did to those people. Just you read it. I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that loose in it. I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did. Here in this first paragraph, we're seeing how foreshadowing and irony are going to work together. The grandmother says she would never put her kids in this sort of harm, take them the way that this misfit is. And yet, we'll see later in the story, as you already know because you've read the story, that's exactly what she does. So we're both having some foreshadowing here and some irony. It goes on. Bailey didn't look up from his reading, so she wheeled around then and faced the children's mother, a young woman in slacks, whose face was as broad and innocent as a cabbage and was tied around with a green headkerchief that had two joints on the top like rabbit's ears. She was sitting on the sofa, feeding the baby his apricots out of a jar. The children have been to Florida before, the old lady said. You ought to take them somewhere else for a change, so they would see different parts of the world and be broad. They never have been to East Tennessee. So here we see her trying to appeal to the mother in a different way. For her son, it was, there's a misfit. For her daughter-in-law, her appeal is going to be, well, the kids have been here before. We need to broaden their horizons. So she appeals to the mother's sense of wanting to provide more for one's children, right? Again, she is really trying very hard to get her own way. It says the children's mother didn't seem to want to hear her. But the 8-year-old boy, John Wesley, a stocky child with glasses, said, if you don't want to go to Florida, why don't you stay at home? He and the little girl, June Starr, were reading the funny papers on the floor. All right, so we immediately see kind of how these children act. We see this young boy saying, well, just stay at home if you don't want to go, which is not necessarily a polite thing to say to an adult. And we're going to see this with these two kids where they maybe aren't the most respectful kids. Of course, the grandmother is not necessarily the best person. As we'll see, she's quite concerned with appearance and she's quite concerned with her own desires. And that's what's going to lead this family into the trouble they get into. She wouldn't stay at home to be queen for a day, June Star said without raising her yellow head. Yes, and what would you do if this fellow, the misfit, caught you? The grandmother asked. I'd smack his face, John Wesley said. She wouldn't stay at home for $1,000,000, June Star said. Afraid she'd miss something. She has to go everywhere we go. All right, miss, the grandmother said. Just remember that the next time you want me to curl your hair. June Star said her hair was naturally curly. Notice this tone between the grandkids and the grandmother. We are seeing what their relationship looks like. They're taunting her a little bit. They're calling her out on who she is. Basically saying, she's not going to stay at home. And then we also have some more foreshadowing. Well, what would you do if the misfit were near you? And John Wesley says, I'd smack his face. We see later on, clearly, John Wesley would not smack anyone's face, as he's just a child in the face of danger. It goes on. The next morning, the grandmother was the first one in the car, ready to go. She had her big black valise that looked like the head of a hippopotamus in one corner, and underneath it, she was hiding a basket with Pitty Sing, the cat, in it. She didn't intend for the cat to be left alone in the house for 3 days because he would miss her too much, and she was afraid he might brush against one of the gas burners and accidentally asphyxiate himself. Her son Bailey didn't like to arrive at a motel with a cat. She sat in the middle of the back seat with John Wesley and June Star on either side of her. Bailey and the children's mother and the baby sat in the front, and they left Atlanta at 8:45 with the mileage on the car at 55,890. The grandmother wrote this down because she thought it would be interesting to say how many miles they had been when they got back. It took them 20 minutes to reach the outskirts of the city. Okay, so here we learn a little bit more. First and foremost, we learn that the grandmother is hiding her cat. She is concerned about her cat, so she brings it with her, but she's doing this against the will of her son. But she isn't willing to leave the cat behind no matter what her son wants, because she doesn't want the cat to be alone. She's afraid the cat will get into trouble. We also see that she's concerned with the mileage of the car, and this may seem like a detail that doesn't matter, and yet it kind of does, because she wants to be able to come back and tell people, we went this many miles. This provides this outlook, or this look into her life, suggesting maybe her braggadocious nature. In the next paragraph, it says, the old lady settled herself comfortably, removing her white cotton gloves and putting them up with her purse on the shelf in front of the back window. The children's mothers still had on slacks and still had her hair tied up in a green kerchief, but the grandmother had on a navy blue straw sailor hat with a bunch of white violets on the brim and a navy blue dress with a small white dot in the brim. Her collars and cuffs were white organdy trimmed with lace, and at her neckline she had a pinned and purple spray of cloth violets containing a sachet. In case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once she was a lady. Okay, so at this point, we get to see what drives this grandmother. She's very concerned about appearance. She's concerned that if she ends up dead on the highway, again, some more of our irony and foreshadowing, that whomever found her would immediately know she was a lady. Basically, and we'll find this out later, obviously, when she does in fact meet her death, she has dressed for her own funeral in a way. She has dressed herself for her own death. Notice the juxtaposition here between the grandmother and the mother. The mother of the children she's wearing slacks. She has her hair tied up with her kerchief. There's nothing there fancy about what she's doing. She's just looking every day. This is meant to show us just how much the grandmother is dressing up for the times, if you will. It also gives us that further insight into her character about how much appearance is important to her. I'm going to skip down just a little bit into some of the dialogue here. It says, let's go through Georgia fast so we won't have to look at it much, John Wesley said. If I were a little boy, said the grandmother, I wouldn't talk about my native state that way. Tennessee has the mountains and Georgia has the hills. Tennessee is just a hillbilly dumping ground, John Wesley said, and Georgia is a lousy state too. You said it, June Star said. In my time, said the grandmother, folding her thin, veined fingers, children were more respectful of their native states and their parents and everything else. People did right then. Oh, look at the cute little pickaninny, she said, and pointed to a Negro child standing in the door of a shack. Wouldn't that make a picture now? She said, and they all turned and looked at the little Negro out of the back window. He waved. He didn't have any breeches on, June Star said. He probably didn't have any, the grandmother explained. Um, so we see here some pretty racist depictions here of this African American child and the way the grandmother and the children are looking at this child as a as something to be seen, as a spectacle, and it really brings some insight into the mindset of the time, particularly in this area of the South. We see them looking at themselves as superior to this child. Notice June Star says that he didn't have any breeches on. Notice that the grandmother, does mention that the child is cute, but again, the child is there for her personal gain, her personal ability to look at the child, if you will. It goes on. The grandmother offered to hold the baby, and the children's mother passed him over the front seat to her. She sat him on her knee and bounced him and told him about the things they were passing. She rolled her eyes and screwed up her mouth and stuck her leathery thin face into his smooth, bland one. Occasionally he gave it a faraway smile. They passed a large cotton field with 5 or 6 graves fenced in the middle of it, like a small island. Look at the graveyard, the grandmother said, pointing it out. That was the old family burying ground. That belongs to the plantation. Where's the plantation? John Wesley asked. Gone with the wind, said the grandmother. Ha ha. So here we're getting some setting of the scene, understanding of where they're at, what things look like. Notice that she points out a graveyard. That's important. And then we are going to skip down because the kids are getting a little bit antsy, and then in this paragraph it says, the grandmother said she would tell them a story if they would keep quiet. When she told a story, she rolled her eyes and waved her head and was very dramatic. She said once, when she was a maiden lady, she had been courted by a Mr. Edgar Atkins Teagarden from Jasper, Georgia. She said he was a very good-looking man and a gentleman, and that he brought her a watermelon every Saturday afternoon with his initials cut into it, E-A-T. Well, one Saturday, she said, Mr. Teagarden brought the watermelon, and there was nobody at home, and he left it on the front porch and returned in his buggy to Jasper. But she never got the watermelon, she said, because a boy ate it when he saw the initials E-A-T. This story tickled John Wesley's funny bone, and he giggled and giggled, but June Star didn't think it was any good. She said she wouldn't marry a man that just brought a watermelon on Saturday. The grandmother said she would have done well to marry Mr. Teagarden, because he was a gentleman and he had bought Coca-Cola stock when it first came out, and that he had died only a few years ago, a very wealthy man. Okay, so here we get this story, and we understand the important thing to note here is that the grandmother says, you know what, I should have married this guy. I would have done well for it because he ended up being wealthy. Again, we're getting another piece of insight into her character. Again, in this paragraph, we see racial discrimination being brought, so that's worth noting as well. Again, more insight into the times and insight into this particular character's character. Speaking of that, it's important to note something about Southern writers, particularly Southern writers during the time that Flannery O'Connor was writing. This story was published in 1955, and during this time, and this is still pretty true of Southern writers delved in what was called the grotesque. And what grotesque is when oddball characters and characters that are perhaps horrific, they experience, or the writer really explores these characters and how their differences set them apart. They're over-the-top characters lots of times. So in this case, we see this grandmother who is this Christian lady who's an over-the-top hypocrite. We see this horrific scene that happens where the misfit and his men kill this family. This all is part of what the grotesque is. Now, I mentioned how it's horrific that this family is killed, and it certainly is. But one of the things that we have to consider is that now this event of this family being killed, while very sad, we maybe look at it a little bit differently, because now we get lots of news of things like this happening. Just yesterday, if you are watching this video on October 28, 2018, just yesterday there was a shooting at a synagogue in Pennsylvania, killing at least 11 people. It was an anti-Semitic act. Earlier this week, there was a man in southern Florida who was sending out pipe bombs to Democratic heavyweights, if you will, Democratic people who have some influence. So we have kind of grown accustomed to this violence, but in 1955, this violence was not necessarily something that people would have been super accustomed to, because even if things were violent, and there was plenty of violence during this time, it wasn't something that people knew about as regularly as we know about it now in the world that we live in, with the internet, where we know what's going on all around the world all the time, and TV being what it is. It took much longer for news to come at that time. It's also probably a touch more violent in these sorts of ways than it was back then, but I don't know the statistics on that, so please don't hold me to that. Okay. So then we see that the family is going to stop, and it's going to be Red Sammy's famous barbecue, none like famous Red Sammy's Red Sam, the fat boy with a happy laugh, a veteran. Red Sammy's your man. Notice that it is our Red Sammy here that we have here, and they're going to stop here, and we're going to have a little bit of a conversation that goes on here. And I'm going to pick up in the paragraph that says it starts inside the tower, but I'm going to move down just a little bit. It says, June Star said, play something she could tap to. So the children's mother put in another dime and played a fast number, and June Star stepped out onto the dance floor and did her tap routine. Ain't she cute? Red Sam's wife said, leaning over the counter. Would you like to come be my little girl? No, I certainly wouldn't, June Star said. I wouldn't live in a broken down place like this for $1,000,000. And she ran back to the table. Ain't she cute? The woman repeated, stretching her mouth politely. Aren't you ashamed? Hissed the grandmother. Red Sam came in and told his wife to quit lounging on the counter and hurry up with these people's orders. His khaki trousers reached just up to his hip bones, and his stomach hung over them like a sack of meal swaying under his shirt. He came over and sat down at the table nearby and let out a combination sigh and yodel. You can't win, he said. You can't win, and he wiped his sweating face off with a gray handkerchief. These days you just don't know who to trust. Ain't that the truth? People are certainly not nice like they used to be, said the grandmother. Two fellers come in here last week, Red Sammy said, driving a Chrysler. It was a old beat-up car, but it was a good one, and these boys looked all right to me. Said they worked at the mill, and I let them fellers charge their gas they bought. Now, why did I do that? Because you're a good man, the grandmother said at once. Yes'm, I suppose so, Red Sam said, as if he were struck with his answer. His wife brought the orders, carrying the 5 plates all at once without a tray, 2 in each hand and 1 balanced on her arm. It isn't a soul in this green world of God's that you can trust, she said, and I don't count nobody out of that. Not nobody, she repeated, looking at Red Sammy. Did you hear about that criminal, the misfit that escaped? Asked the grandmother. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if he didn't attack this place right here, said the woman. If he hears about it being here, I wouldn't be none surprised to see him. If he hears it's 2 cents in the cash register, I wouldn't be at all surprised if he... That'll do, Red Sam said. Go bring these people their Coca-Colas. And the woman went off to get the rest of the order. A good man is hard to find, Red Sammy said. Everything else is getting terrible. I remember the day you could go off and leave your screen door unlatched. Not no more. He and the grandmother discussed better times. The old lady said that in her opinion Europe was entirely to blame for the way things were now. She said that the way Europe acted, you would think we were made of money, and Red Sam said it was no use talking about it. She was exactly right. So we have this conversation happen, and first of all we see June Star being rude, and then that brings to a conversation between Red Sammy and the grandmother. And Red Sam and the grandmother lament times gone by, how things were better in the good old days. And we often hear, older people say things like this, right? Um, and they talk about how, well, a good man is hard to find, and how Red Sam is a good man because he was being nice, letting these people charge their gas. Although some of us might argue that that was him not being so smart, if you will. Um, and so what we see here is this um the grandmother being willing to say, yep, you're a good man, but you know what? I don't trust anybody, and good men are hard to find. We see our callback to the title of the story here. A good man is hard to find. Although apparently Red Sam, according to the grandmother, is a good man, but that's likely because he's who is sitting in front of the grandmother to talk at this time. All right, so then we're going to see the family get back into their car, and once they're back into their car, they are going to continue driving, and we're going to pick up here. It says, they drove off again into the hot afternoon. The grandmother took cat naps and woke up every few minutes with her own snoring. Outside of Toomsboro, notice the name here, Toomsboro, she woke up and recalled an old plantation that she had visited in the neighborhood once when she was a young lady. All right, so this plantation is going to be important because we're going to see the grandmother asked to go here. And the way she's going to get what she wants is by manipulating the kids. She's going to convince the kids that they want to go. She says there was a secret panel in the house, she said craftily, not telling the truth, but wishing that she were. Notice she is lying here. And the story went that all the family silver was hidden in it when Sherman came through, but it was never found. So she's going to entice the children to wanting to go to this. And it's going to be because she is going to want to get the kids to make the case for her to stop at this plantation. The grandmother says, it's not from here. I know. It wouldn't take over 20 minutes. Bailey was looking straight ahead. His jaw was as rigid as a horseshoe. No, he said. The children began to yell and scream. So here we see that the grandmother has weaponized the children against Bailey so that she can get what she wants. While she had condemned their bad behavior before, now she is in favor of it. So ultimately we see Bailey say, all right, he shouted and drew the car to a stop at the side of the road. Will you all shut up? Will you all just shut up for 1 second? If you don't shut up, we won't go anywhere. It would be very educational for them, the grandmother murmured. Notice here she's saying, oh, well, this would be, something that they can learn about, be a good parent. All right, said Bailey, but get this. This is the only time we're going to stop for anything like this. This is the one and only time. Again, we have some foreshadowing here. Yep, it is, in fact, the only time that they are going to stop. Okay, so I'm going to skip through some of this conversation and pick up here. It says, the road looked as if no one had traveled on it in months. This should set the scene that this is pretty ominous. This is not a good sign that this road has not been traveled on. We see the grandmother say, it's not much further, the grandmother said, and just as she said it, a horrible thought came to her. The thought was so embarrassing that she turned red in the face, and her eyes dilated, and her feet jumped up, upsetting the valise in the corner. The instant the valise moved, the newspaper top she had over her basket under it rose with a snarl, and Pixing, the cat, sprang onto Bailey's shoulder. The children were thrown to the floor, and their mother, clutching the baby, was thrown out the door onto the ground. The old lady was thrown into the front seat. The car turned over once and landed right side up in a gulch off the side of the road. Bailey remained in the driver's seat with the cat, gray striped, with a broad white face and an orange nose clinging to the neck like a caterpillar. As soon as the children saw that they could move their arms and legs, they scrambled out of the car, shouting, "We've had an accident!" The grandmother was curled up under the dashboard, hoping she was injured so that Bailey's wrath would not come down on her all at once. The horrible thought she had had before the accident was that the house she had remembered so vividly was not in Georgia, but was in Tennessee. Okay, so they ultimately had this accident, and it is the grandmother's fault. Notice the grandmother's deception from earlier, hiding the cat, and then her realization that she had made a mistake and they weren't in the right place causes this accident. And this accident is going to ultimately be the undoing of all of them. The grandmother's lies, the grandmother's deception have led to this. We're going to see June Star say, but nobody's killed. Again, we have some irony because this is going to come, June Star said with disappointment as the grandmother limped out of the car, her hat still pinned on her head, but the broken front brim standing up at the jaunty angle. Notice it says that June Star was disappointed that no one had been killed. Again, we have some irony here, some foreshadowing. So they just say, well, maybe a car will come along. The grandmother ultimately decides that she will not mention the house was in Tennessee. Again, she is going to take her lie and keep that to herself. From a distance, you're going to see a car. And it says, it came to a stop over them, and for some minutes the driver looked down with a steady, expressionless gaze to where they were sitting and didn't speak. Then he turned his head and muttered something to the other two, and they got out. One was a fat boy in the black trousers and a red sweatshirt with a silver stallion embossed on the front of it. He moved around and on the right side of them and stood staring, his mouth partly open in a kind of loose grin. The other had on khaki pants and a blue striped coat and a gray hat pulled down very low, hiding most of his face. He came around slowly on the left side. Neither spoke. The driver got out of the car and stood by the side of it, looking down at them. He was an older man than the other two. His hair was just beginning to gray, and he wore silver-rimmed spectacles that gave him a scholarly look. He had a long creased face and didn't have on any shirt or undershirt. He had on blue jeans that were too tight for him and was holding a black hat and gun. The two boys also had guns. "We've had an accident," the children screamed. Okay, so we get our description of the men who are out there. These are not particularly men that look like they are super respectable if we're going on the grandmother's descriptions of things, how, put together she is. We see the older man here doesn't even have on a shirt, who is the misfit. Notice also that it says that his glasses, his spectacles are silver rimmed and make him look scholarly. The grandmother had the peculiar feeling that the bespectacled man was someone she knew. And here is our first sign that things are going bad. His face was similar to her. It was as familiar to her as if she had known him all her life, but she could not recall who he was. Again, this is our first sign that, something is afoot here. "All right, we turned over twice," said the grandmother. "Notice the exaggeration. She's lying here." "Once," he corrected. "We seen it happen. Try their car and see if it will turn, Hiram," he said quietly to the boy with the gray hat. Notice he calls her on it immediately. Nope, it wasn't twice. It was once. And so she's put on in her place. Then we're going to skip down just a little bit. Behind them, the line of woods gaped like a dark, open mouth. This is important. Anytime we see woods in literature, as a general rule, woods are considered with things that are bad that are going to happen, with evil. And this is no different. "Come here," said their mother. "Look here now," Bailey began suddenly. "We're in a predicament. We're in—" The grandmother shrieked. She scrambled to her feet and stood staring. "You're the misfit," she said. "I recognized you at once." Again, we see her lie. She did not recognize him at once, although she did see that he seemed familiar to her. "Yes'm," the man said, smiling slightly as if he were pleased in spite of himself to be known. "But it would have been better for you lady, if you hadn't recognized me." Okay, so he says it would be better for them if they hadn't recognized him, but would it have? That's really I think the overarching question of this story of, okay, yeah, he's telling them it would have been better if you hadn't have mentioned that you knew who I was. And on some level, this is true, because now he's forced to deal with the fact that these people have seen him. But he's checking to see if their car will turn over. I really believe that even though he says this, that still the fate of this family probably would have ended up the same. Bailey turned his head sharply and said something to his mother that shocked even the children. The old lady began to cry, and the misfit reddened. So we see here that the family recognizes, uh-oh, we're in a predicament. Things are not good. Lady, he said, don't you get upset. Sometimes a man says things he don't mean. I reckon he meant to talk to you that away. You wouldn't shoot a lady, would you? The grandmother said, and removed a clean handkerchief from her cuff and began to slap at her eyes with it. So notice here that it wasn't you wouldn't shoot a family, but it was you wouldn't shoot a lady. This is important because she is appealing to him about herself, not her family, not her grandchildren, none of that. The misfit pointed to the toe of his shoe in the ground and made a little hole and then covered it up. I'd hate to have to, he said. Listen, the grandmother almost screamed. I know you're a good man. You don't look like it. Look a bit like you have common blood. I know you must have come from nice people. So here she is going to try to appeal to our misfit through his lineage, where he came from, who he is, suggesting that he must be good. He's not a bad guy. And again, we see this emphasis on a good man. We also see that she's lying. There's no way she thinks he is a good man. He says, yes, ma'am. Finest people in the world. When he smiled, he showed a row of strong white teeth. God never met a finer woman than my mother, and my daddy's heart was pure gold, he said. The boy with the red sweatshirt had come around behind them and was standing with his gun at his hip. The misfit squatted down on the ground. Watch them children, Bobby Lee. You know they make me nervous. He looked at the 6 of them huddled together in front of him, and he seemed to be embarrassed, as if he couldn't think of anything to say. Ain't a cloud in the sky, he remarked, looking up at it. Don't see no sun, but don't see no clouds either. This look at the sky is important. It's not sunny, it's not cloudy, but it's clear, if you will. Yes, it's a beautiful day, said the grandmother. So then they're going to get to this point where it's like they've got to figure out what they're going to do. The misfit has to figure out what he's going to do with this family. And we're going to see the misfit coming to a decision. Well, first you and Bobby Lee, get him and that little boy to step over yonder with you, the misfit said, pointing to Bailey and John Wesley. The boys want to ask you something, he said to Bailey. Would you mind stepping back in them woods with them? Listen, Bailey began. We're in a terrible predicament. Nobody realizes what this is, and his voice cracked. His eyes were as blue and as intense as the parrots in his shirt, and he remained perfectly still. The grandmother reached up to adjust her hat brim as if she were going to the woods with him, but it came off in her hand. She stood staring at it, and after a second she let it fall on the ground. Hiram pulled Bailey up by the arm as if he were assisting an old man. John Wesley caught hold of his father's hand, and Bobby Lee followed. They went off toward the woods, and just as they reached the dark edge, Bailey turned, and supporting himself against a gray, naked pine trunk, he shouted, I'll be back in a minute, Mama. Wait on me. Come back this instant, the mother shrilled, but they all disappeared into the woods. Bailey, boy, the grandmother called in a tragic voice, but she found she was looking at the misfit, squatting on the ground in front of her. I just know you're a good man, she said desperately. You're not a bit common. No, I ain't a good man. Notice here that the misfit's like, yeah, you're saying I'm good, but I'm not, and I know I'm not. And he's going to stand behind that. The misfit said after a second, as if he had considered her statement carefully, but I ain't the worst in the world, neither. My daddy said I was a different breed of dog from my brothers and sisters. You know, Daddy said, it's some that can live their whole life without asking about it, and it's others that has to know why it is, and this boy is one of the latters. He's going to be into everything. He put on his black hat and looked up suddenly, and then away deep into the woods as if he were embarrassed again. I'm sorry I don't have a shirt before you ladies, he said, hunching his shoulders slightly. We buried our clothes that we had on when we escaped, and we're just making do until we can get better. We borrowed these from some folks we met. Notice he says that they borrowed their clothes, which probably indicates that they also had killed those people, especially when we'll see a little bit later on that they're going to be wearing Bailey's clothes before all is said and done. But more importantly here, we see that even the misfit's father had said he was different than other kids, that he was different than other boys, that he wanted, that he was going to be, quote, into everything. And this is an important revelation about the Misfit. And he's also very apologetic about his clothes. And the mother says, well, Bailey has some in his shirts, in his suitcase. The Misfit says, oh, that's great. And then, where are they taking him? The children's mother screamed. Daddy was a card himself, the Misfit said. You couldn't put anything over on him. He never got in any trouble with the authorities, though. Just had a knack for taunting them. Of handling them, not taunting them, I'm sorry. You could be honest, too, if only you'd try, the grandmother says. Think of how wonderful it would be to settle down and live a comfortable life and not have to think about somebody chasing you all the time. So here she's going to appeal to him in a little bit of a different way. It's not going to be a case of, I know you're a good man, but you could be good. And she's trying to appeal to his sense of goodness, right? To hopefully save herself. The grandmother noticed how thin his shoulder blades were just behind his hat because she was standing up looking down on him. Do you ever pray? She asked. He shook his head. All she saw was the black hat wiggle between his shoulder blades. No, he said. There was a pistol shot from the woods, followed closely by another, then silence. The old lady's head jerked around. She could hear the wind move through the treetops like a long, satisfied insuck of breath. Bailey boy, she called. So here we see that her son and her grandson have been shot. She calls out for her son. We understand that that's what's happening here in the woods. I was a gospel singer for a while, the Misfit said. I've been most everything. Been in the armed service, both land and sea, at home and abroad, been twice married, been an undertaker, been with the railroads, plowed Mother Earth, been in a tornado, seen a man burnt alive once. And he looked up at the children's mother and the little girl who were sitting close together, their faces white and their eyes glassy. I even seen a woman flogged, he said. Pray, pray, the grandmother began. Pray, pray. So she's saying to him, you can pray, you can get over this, you can get better, you can move on from this, you don't have to be bad. She's, again, still trying to appeal to his, sense of wanting to be good. Maybe not his sense of goodness, because that might be going too far. But we see that the Misfit is who he is, and he knows who he is, if you will. I never was a bad boy that I remember of, the Misfit said in an almost dreamy voice, but somewhere along the line I done something wrong and got sent to the penitentiary. I was buried alive, and he looked up and held her attention to him by a steady stare. That's when you should have started to pray, she said. What did you do to get sent to the penitentiary the first time? Turn to the right. It was a wall, the Misfit said, looking up again at the cloudless sky. Turn to the left. It was a wall. Look up. It was a ceiling. Look down. It was a floor. I forget what I done, lady. I sat there, trying to remember what it was I done, and I ain't recalled it to this day. Once in a while, I would think it was coming to me, but it never come. Okay, so we learned that he's been in jail, and we also know that he doesn't know what he did. And sometimes we want to believe, especially based on what he's going to say a little bit later on, that he was wrongfully accused, and that was what got him here. But the fact that he doesn't remember it suggests that maybe he was wrongfully accused, or maybe that he has blocked it out. Maybe they put you in by mistake. No, it wasn't no mistake. They had the papers on me. Notice this idea of having the papers. The idea of having the papers means, yep, there's proof. You must have stolen something. Nobody had nothing I wanted. It was a head doctor at the penitentiary said that what I had done was kill my daddy, but I known that for a lie. My daddy died in 1919 of an epidemic flu, and I never had a thing to do with it. But he was buried in the Mount Hopewell Baptist Churchyard, and you can go there and see for yourself. Okay, so he says, nope, I didn't kill my dad. This is where he's buried, and yet they had the papers on him for killing his dad. Notice that earlier he said that his dad said he was a different kind. He was asking questions. He was going to be into something, that he was different than his brothers and sisters. I think all of that indicates that there was probably something mentally going on with the Misfit, if you will, and that there's a possibility here that he simply doesn't remember killing his dad. He's told himself that it's something else. The grandmother comes back to this and says, if you would pray, the old lady said, Jesus would help you. That's right, the misfit said. Well, then, why don't you pray? I don't want no help. I'm doing all right by myself. So notice here that he's okay with who he is and with what he's doing. And he's not really willing to come back on that. So then here we see that Bobby Lee and Hiram are coming back, and Bobby Lee has Bailey's shirt, the yellow shirt with bright blue parrots. Throw me that shirt, Bobby Lee, the misfit said. The shirt came flying at him and landed on his shoulder, and he put it on. Him putting on Bailey's shirt is going to be important when we get to our moment of grace a little bit later on. The grandmother couldn't name what the shirt reminded her of. And clearly it's Bailey. No, lady, the misfit said while he was buttoning it up. I found out the crime don't matter. You can do one thing or you can do another, kill a man or take a tire off his car, because sooner or later you're going to forget what it was you done and just be punished for it. He's calling into question our justice system, and yet it, on some way, he's like, oh, well, you might not even remember what it was. Again, this is kind of indicating that he doesn't have 100% wherewithal of what he has done and the variety of things he has done. The children's mother had begun to make heaving noises as if she couldn't get her breath. Lady, would you and that little girl like to step off yonder with Bobby Lee and Hiram and join your husband? Yes, thank you, the mother said faintly. Now, let's be clear here. The mother knows that Bailey and John Wesley were killed, and her response to this is, yes, thank you. It's as if, for her, accepting her fate and her death is better than sitting here waiting for it. Yes, just let me go there and we will all be reunited in death. Her left arm dangled helplessly and she was holding the baby who had gone to sleep in another. Help that lady up, Hiram, the misfit said as he struggled to climb out of the ditch. Then we're going to skip down to where the misfit and the grandmother are alone, because this is where we really kind of get to the heart of everything that is of significance in this story. It says, alone, the misfit, the grandmother found that she had lost her voice. There was not a cloud in the sky nor any sun. There was nothing around her but woods. She wanted to tell him that he must pray. She opened and closed her mouth several times before anything came out. Finally, she found herself saying, Jesus, Jesus, meaning, Jesus, will you help? But the way she was saying it, it sounded as if she might be cursing. Okay, so we've found the grandmother who's never had a lack of words, suddenly unable to talk. Her voice has been taken from her because she's ultimately at this point understands what her fate is going to be. And when she tries to call on Jesus to help her, rather than it sounding like, Jesus, please help me, it sounds like Jesus, God, a cursing Jesus. This should indicate something important about her faith in Jesus. Her use of his name in this instance does not sound like prayer. It sounds as though she is blaming him. And this is helping us understand her moral code. And we'll come back to this, but do remember this piece. Yes'm, the misfit said as if he agreed. Jesus thrown everything off balance. It was the same with him as it was with me, except he hadn't committed any crime, and they could prove I had committed one because they had the papers on me, of course. They never shown me my papers. That was why I signed myself now. I said long ago, you get you a signature and sign everything you do and keep a copy of it. Then you'll know what you've done and what you can hold up the crime to the punishment and see if they match. And if in the end you have something to prove you ain't been treated right, I call myself the misfit, he said, because I can't make what all I done wrong fit with all I gone through in punishment. Okay, so here we get some insight into the misfit's his beliefs about Jesus as well as his beliefs about crime and punishment, and into his moral code. So here's a couple of things here. First, he says Jesus threw everything off balance, and he compares himself to Jesus, with the exception that they could prove all the things that the misfit's done. And the misfit says that basically, as long as there's proof to match the punishment, then it should all work out. However, he feels that his punishments have outweighed the crimes. But keep in mind that he doesn't remember some of the crimes he's been accused of, which does not mean he didn't commit them. It just means that he is has no memory of them or is not willing to remember them. There was a piercing scream from the woods, followed closely by a pistol report. Does it seem right to you, lady, that one is punished a heap and another ain't punished at all? This is an important line because the misfit has clearly done some bad things and has been punished, but the grandmother, who is a liar, who is braggadocious, who is prideful, who is manipulative, who is selfish, hasn't had any sort of punishment for those things up until this point, right? And while he's maybe not directly talking to her, we as readers understand that this is in many ways an indictment of the grandmother, who is not a good person, no matter what she would have you believe is a good Christian woman who's calling on Jesus. And yet she's been able to live her life as she's wanted to. She's been able to be selfish. She's been able to be manipulative. Jesus, the old lady cried, you've got good blood. I know you wouldn't shoot a lady. I know you've come from nice people. Pray, Jesus, you ought not to shoot a lady. I'll give you all the money I've got. Lady, the misfit said, looking beyond her into the woods. There never was a body that give the undertaker a tip. Here he says, I am the undertaker. I am taking you to death. You don't need to give me your money because this is what's coming. There were 2 more pistol reports, and the grandmother raised her head like a parched old turkey hen, crying out for water, and called, Bailey boy, as if her heart would break. Jesus was the only one that ever raised the dead, the misfit continued, and he shouldn't have done it. He'd thrown everything off balance. If he did what he said, then it's nothing for you to do but throw away everything and follow him. And if he didn't, then it's nothing for you to do but enjoy the few minutes you've got left the best way you can, by killing somebody or burning down his house or doing some other meanness to him. No pleasure but meanness, he said, and his voice had come almost to a snarl. So he says, yeah, if Jesus actually did what he said he did, sure, let's all follow him. But if he didn't, then we should have fun being mean. He says there's no pleasure in life but meanness. The way to have pleasure in life is through meanness. And then we see the grandmother say, maybe he didn't raise the dead. The old lady mumbled, not knowing what she was saying and feeling so dizzy that she sank down in the ditch with her legs twisted under her. This is an important piece. She ultimately says, maybe he didn't raise the dead. She has told him repeatedly, she's told the misfit repeatedly, you must, pray, call on Jesus. Jesus will help you. That's what we keep hearing from her. And yet, in this moment, what we get is, you know what, maybe he didn't. She is willing to go against her beliefs to try to save herself. We see her abandoning her beliefs in a selfish attempt to save herself. She doesn't say, no, I know Jesus did this. She says, maybe he didn't. I wasn't there, so I can't say he didn't, the misfit said. I wish I would have been there, he said, hitting the ground with his fist. It ain't right I wasn't, because if I had been there, I would have known. Listen, lady, he said in a high voice. If I had been there, I would have known, and I wouldn't be like I am now. His voice seemed about to crack, and the grandmother's head cleared for an instant. So he says, if I knew, then I would be different. If I knew that Jesus had done these things, I would do differently. So he has based his moral code on this premise that I don't know if this whole Jesus thing is right or wrong or true or not, but because I don't know and I'm not sure of it, I'm going to do what I want to do, and I'm going to do what brings me pleasure, which is meanness. And if the punishment fits the crime, then cool. And he stands by what he believes all the way through this. No matter how the grandmother tries to appeal to him, he's a good man, he comes from good blood, he's, he should pray. All of these things he turns down and says, nope. He says, I am who I am. I believe what I believe. And now we're going to have our moment of grace. His voice seemed about to crack, and the grandmother's head cleared for an instant. This moment of her head clearing is this moment of grace. She saw the man's face twisted close to her own as if he were going to cry, and she murmured, why, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children. She reached out to touch him on the shoulder. At this moment, when she says, "You're one of my babies," she is having a legitimate moment where she can see the humanity in the misfit. He's not just a murderer. He's this child who needs guidance. Let me be clear. He is not biologically one of her children. Do not misunderstand this. This is not what she is saying. This is not what he is saying. This is not what the story is saying. She's saying that she feels a human connection with him. He could be one of her own children. And so she reaches out to touch him in that way. However, this is how he responds. The misfit came back as if a snake had bitten him and shot her 3 times through the chest. Then he put his gun down on the ground and took his glasses off and began to clean them. Ultimately, though, even though she has this moment of humanity, it still leads to her demise because it shakes the misfit. He doesn't know what to do with it. However, we will see that he is affected by this in the ending of the story. Hiram and Bobby Lee returned from the woods and stood over the ditch, looking down at the grandmother, who half sat and half lay in a puddle of blood, and her legs crossed under her like a child, and her face smiling up at the cloudless sky. Without his glasses, the misfit's eyes were red-rimmed and pale and defenseless-looking. "Take her off and throw her where you thrown the others," he said, picking up the cat that was rubbing itself against his leg. "She was a talker, wasn't she?" Bobby Lee said, sliding down the ditch with a yodel. "She would have been a good woman," the misfit said, "if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life." Okay, this is an important line because it says she could have been good because there was goodness in her. That moment of grace she experiences, he recognizes that she saw something in him. And while it freaked him out and he ultimately reacts with killing her, it says she would have been good if there'd been somebody there to kill her. And this is kind of a funny turn of phrase. Yep, she would have been good. But there's truth in it, that only the goodness comes out in this woman who is selfish and is a liar and who exaggerates and who is concerned with appearance and things to brag about. But in those moments, she is able to see humanity in a person that society has not been able to see that, which is an element of goodness. "Some fun," Bobby Lee said. "Shut up, Bobby Lee," the misfit said. "It's no real pleasure in life." And earlier, we heard the misfit say, the only pleasure in life is meanness. Meanness is the pleasure of life. But now he's saying there is no pleasure. And this is how we know this has affected him, because what he took pleasure from, this meanness, killing others, hurting others, doing bad things, no longer appeals to him. And understand that as a result of what he has to say here. Let me just very quickly go through the questions, see if there's anything that needed to be answered. When we think about moral codes, that was the first question. With the grandmother, her moral code, she said her moral code was, she's a good Christian woman, but she wavers from that moral code. She denies Christ. She lies. She deceives. Lying and deceiving, same thing. She manipulates. She brags about things. She's concerned with appearance. She's racist. All of these things that do not show us this idea that she has a moral code that she's strict with. However, the misfit, while his moral code does not match up to what we consider to be morally right, his idea is that if you did something and there's papers on it and the crime matches the punishment, then that's good. And he does not at any point waver from what he believes. He does not sway based on what the grandmother has to say. It doesn't matter that she says that he should pray or that he's good or this, that, or the other. The only little bit of sway we see in the end for him is that moment where he says she could have been good and that there's no pleasure in life. We see that there is some change in him, but it's not necessarily to his moral code. We talked about the moment of grace, so I think we're good there. That was your second question. We see how both characters are affected. We see the grandmother being able to see the humanity and the goodness in someone who is otherwise considered bad. We see the misfit changing his view on killing and hurting. The third question had to do with irony and foreshadowing. I think I did a pretty good job of pointing out elements of this, so I think you probably have a fair understanding of how that's used. And then the fourth question I want to get to is Catholicism and Flannery O'Connor's Catholic upbringing. The fourth question from the discussion board said, as a devout Catholic living in a Protestant Southern United States, Flannery O'Connor often explores the hypocrisy of the people living in what she has often regarded as the Bible Belt of the country. How does she explore this idea in the story? What impact does it have on the reader? Respond in 6 to 8 sentences. Okay. I don't know why I told you to respond in 6 to 8 sentences while I was reading off the question. Anyway, so here's the thing. The Bible Belt of the United States is your Protestant Christian. So your Methodist, your Baptist, your Lutheran, your Wesleyan, all of the Presbyterian, all of those are our Protestant Christian sect. And then the other side to Christianity are the Catholics, okay? Flannery O'Connor once said that she writes because she is Catholic, not though she is Catholic. So she does it, she feels that her writing comes from a place of her Catholicism. And she really struggled living in the South where there were all of these Christians, or these people who called themselves Christians. I don't know. I can't speak to, what was actually their beliefs or not. But what she was seeing was that there was these people who were going to church and were really, faithful to church and said that they were believers of the Bible and followers of Jesus. And yet when she saw them out in public, they were doing things that were very much in contrast to the teachings of the Bible. And she, because she was a devout Catholic, really struggled with that. And so she kind of grouped it as a devout Catholic, the Catholics against the Protestants. And she doesn't, I don't think, really mean that. I think it's a case of she considers herself a conscious Catholic, which means that she is constantly working on being a good Catholic. And it's not that she's saying that there aren't Protestants who are that way too. She's calling on people, because particularly in the Bible Belt region, it's not uncommon for everyone to say, yep, I'm a Christian. And yet she was saying, yeah, everyone's saying they're Christians, but look at what they're doing. Some of you in your discussion boards mentioned how she was being judgmental herself, and maybe that was a little bit hypocritical. And there's certainly some room for that. But it wasn't so much that she was being hypocritical, because notice she still affords those hypocrites a moment of grace, that moment where God extends his grace to her character. So it's not really that she's saying, oh, well, they can't, be good, or that they can't get into heaven, or whatever the case may be. It was more that she wanted to shine a light more so than judge. She wanted these people to say, oh, maybe I'm being hypocritical. So it was more she was trying to use her work as a teaching for this type of person, rather than to totally just indict them and tell them they're terrible. And again, we can point to that moment of grace to be able to say, oh, she is cognizant of the fact that, they're not just terrible. She's not saying, oh, you're horrible. She is still allowing them to have that grace. I hope this video has helped you out. If you have questions or you want help with this story, please let me know.